Before you hear this story, I want you to be clear about something. This isn't really about a device. It isn't about technology or money, though both of those things are part of it. It's about how the people who are supposed to love you can learn to use that love against you, quietly, carefully, over a long period of time. And how you can be so busy trying to keep everyone comfortable that you don't notice until you're almost gone. Ask yourself something as you listen. If the person doing this to you smiled every time they walked through your door, would you have caught it sooner than I did? My name is Howard. I'm 63 years old. I retired 2 years ago after 31 years as a structural engineer with the city of Memphis. I spent 3 decades making sure bridges held and overpasses didn't crack and that the weight of traffic could be calculated down to a decimal point. I was good at it. I was the kind of man people called when something wasn't adding up. The irony of that isn't lost on me now. My wife Gloria passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We didn't have time to prepare, which I think is the cruelest part. You expect years of slow goodbyes, and instead, you get 11 weeks of watching someone become smaller. After she was gone, the house in Whitehaven felt like a building I'd forgotten how to live in. Same walls, same kitchen, same squeaky hinge on the back door. I kept meaning to fix. Everything exactly the same except for the one thing that made it a home. My younger brother, Curtis, stepped in. That's the only way I can describe it. He stepped in, the way you step into a room that's been left dark too long. He and his wife Nadine started coming around more, bringing food, checking on me, making sure I wasn't sitting alone in the evenings. At the time, I was grateful. I told people at church how lucky I was to have family like that. I meant it. Curtis is 58. He works in logistics, manages a warehouse distribution center outside Bartlett. He's always been organized, practical, the kind of man who reads the fine print before he signs anything. We weren't close when we were young. There was a gap between us, not just the 5 years in age, but something harder to name. A competition that neither of us ever acknowledged out loud. When we got older, that gap seemed to close. I thought it had healed. I was wrong. The smart speaker arrived on my birthday, November. Curtis and Nadine came over with a cake from the bakery on Poplar and a wrapped box about the size of a shoebox. Inside was one of those home assistant devices, the kind you set on a counter and talk to. Ask it the weather, play music, set timers. Curtis had already downloaded the app on his phone so he could help me set it up. He stood in my kitchen for 40 minutes making sure everything was connected, showed me how to ask it questions, showed me how it linked to my phone. He said, and I remember this clearly, he said, "This way you're never really alone in the house." I thanked him. I meant that too. I set the speaker on the kitchen counter between the coffee maker and the window that looks out over the backyard. Gloria used to keep a bird feeder out there. I never took it down. Every morning I'd come downstairs, pour my coffee, and the thing would just be sitting there with its little ring of light, waiting. I talked to it the way you talk to anything when you live alone. Idle conversation. Thinking out loud, I'd ask it to play Marvin Gaye while I cooked. I'd tell it to set a reminder for my Tuesday doctor's appointment. I'd read the mail at the kitchen counter and say things like, "Lord, they want to raise the property taxes again," without expecting an answer. That went on for about 6 weeks before my neighbor Ellis changed everything. Ellis Drummond is 71, retired postal inspector. We've lived next door to each other for 19 years and we have the kind of friendship that doesn't require much maintenance. He comes over on Saturday mornings sometimes. We drink coffee and argue about football and complain about the neighborhood association. That's the whole relationship and it's worth more than most. One Saturday, Ellis came over, and while I was pouring coffee, he looked at the speaker on the counter, the way you look at something that doesn't belong in a room, just a half second too long. He asked where I got it. I told him my brother set it up for me. Ellis set his mud down. He said, "Howard, do you know how these things actually work?" I said I had a general idea. Listens for the wake word, streams audio to the cloud. He said that's not all they do, depending on how they're configured. Ellis spent 30 years inspecting mail fraud and wire fraud cases before he retired. He had a way of saying things plainly that I'd always appreciated. He wasn't dramatic about it. He just said, Some of these devices can be set to send clips to a linked account without the owner knowing. Depends on what permissions were set up during installation. Who set this up for you? My brother, I said again. Ellis looked at me. He didn't say anything else right away. He just picked his mug back up and drank his coffee and said, "You might want to look into that." I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the 40 minutes Curtis stood in my kitchen with his phone, setting up permissions I never asked about, linking accounts I never reviewed. I kept thinking about all the things I'd said out loud in that kitchen over 6 weeks. Every phone call I'd taken standing at the counter. Every conversation about Gloria's life insurance payout, which I'd put into a CD at First Tennessee. Every time I'd muttered to myself about my pension, about the house value, about whether I should update my will now that I was living alone. The next morning, I called a friend from church, a woman named Paulette who works in IT security consulting. I didn't tell her everything. I just asked her hypothetically, if someone set up a smart speaker in your home and had admin access to the linked account, what could they see? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, theoretically, everything. Every query, every recording the device captures, every linked account it has access to. The person who holds the admin login essentially has a window into your household. I said, how would you find out if that was happening? She said, you'd need to look at the account settings. Check what devices are linked, what permissions are active, what third-party access has been granted. If you didn't set it up yourself, you might find things you didn't authorize. I thanked her and sat in the living room for a long time after we hung up. The speaker was in the other room. I could hear the faint light hum it makes when it's on standby. That sound had never bothered me before. Now it felt like something breathing. I didn't go to the police yet. I didn't confront Curtis. I did what I'd been trained to do for 31 years when I suspected a structural problem. I gathered information first. I called the company's support line and, after 40 minutes on hold, I got a technician who walked me through the admin account settings. The account had been created under an email address I didn't recognize. Not mine. My name was listed as a secondary user. Curtis had set himself up as the account owner. The technician confirmed that the account owner could access the device's activity log. Voice clips flagged by the system. Location data from linked apps. A history of every connected service. I thanked the technician, wrote down everything he told me, and then I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing dates. Every conversation I remembered having near that speaker. Every financial detail I might have mentioned. Every phone call I'd taken in the kitchen. The list took 2 pages. Ellis came over the next morning and I told him what I'd found. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about him. When I finished, he said, "You know what you need to do." I said, "I'm not sure what I can prove." He said, "You don't need to prove anything yet. You need to understand what he's been building." That word, building. It sat in my chest and wouldn't move. I started paying attention differently after that. I noticed that Curtis had started calling more often, usually after I'd said something significant near the speaker. I'd mentioned to the empty kitchen that I was thinking about selling some of my railroad stock. And 2 days later, Curtis called asking if I'd spoken to a financial advisor lately. I had said out loud while reading the mail that I needed to update the beneficiary on my life insurance. And within a week, Nadine was at my door with a casserole, asking gently if I was getting enough rest, if I'd been feeling confused about anything lately. That last word, confused, it landed differently than it used to. I started keeping a log, dates, times, what I said near the speaker, how long before Curtis or Nadine responded to it. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Not once, not twice. 11 times in the span of 4 weeks. I also started listening differently to the things Curtis said when he called. The language had shifted, gradually. So gradually, I hadn't caught it before. He'd started referring to my house as a lot to manage for one person. He'd ask if I was keeping up with the bills all right. Once he said, and I wrote this down word for word, "At your age, Howard, it's worth thinking about who's going to help you make the big decisions." At your age. I was 63. I ran 8 miles a week. I'd filed my own taxes for 40 years. But when someone says it like that, with that particular kind of concern in their voice, it's designed to make you doubt yourself, to make you wonder if maybe they're right, if maybe the person who loves you sees something you don't. That's the mechanism. That's what I understand now that I didn't understand then. It's not a blunt instrument. It's a slow leak. You don't notice the pressure dropping until you've already lost something. I called Paulette back. I told her everything this time. She went quiet in a way that told me it was worse than she'd let on before. She said she knew someone at the district attorney's office who handled elder financial abuse cases. I wrote down the name. I sat with it for 3 days before I made the call. The investigator's name was Sergeant Whitmore. He was younger than I expected, early 40s, with the kind of methodical patience you earn from years of not being able to show your hand. He listened to everything I had, the account ownership evidence, the call logs, the dates and times, the progression of language Curtis had been using. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Mr. Howard, I want you to understand something. What you're describing, if it's what I think it is, has a name." He explained that using remote monitoring to gather financial information on a family member, combined with a pattern of suggesting cognitive decline without medical basis, was a documented form of elder exploitation. It didn't matter that no money had changed hands yet. The preparation itself was enough to investigate. He asked me not to remove the speaker or change the account settings. He asked me to keep doing exactly what I'd been doing, documenting, staying quiet, not tipping my hand. He said, "The hard part is acting normal when you know what you know." I told him I'd spent 30 years acting calm when I found something wrong in a load-bearing structure. I could manage. I drove home from that meeting and sat in the driveway for a while. The neighborhood was quiet. Leaf blowers somewhere down the block. A kid on a bicycle. The ordinary texture of a Tuesday afternoon. I thought about Curtis at my kitchen counter, helping me set up something that was supposed to make me feel less alone. I went inside and made dinner and said nothing to the speaker. The next morning, I changed my approach. I had a plan and I worked it carefully. I kept the speaker in place. I kept talking near it the way I always had. But now I chose what I said. I mentioned the CD at First Tennessee, but I moved the amount. Said it was less than it was. I said out loud while standing at the counter reading the mail that I'd been thinking about putting the house in a trust, that a friend at church had recommended an estate attorney downtown. I dropped the attorney's name into the air like a stone into still water. Then I waited. Curtis called 3 days later. He said he'd been thinking about me and wanted to come by, maybe sit down and talk about some of the longer-term stuff. He said Nadine had a friend who did estate planning and it might be good to get a second opinion before I locked into anything. A second opinion on a decision I hadn't told him I'd made. I told him that sounded fine. I gave nothing else away. The week after that, I found the document. I wasn't looking for it. I was in the spare bedroom, the one Gloria used as a sewing room, looking for the box of Christmas ornaments. It was early December, and I decided I was going to put up a tree this year. First time since she died. The box wasn't where I thought it was. I moved some things on the closet shelf, and the folder slid down and landed open on the floor. It wasn't one of my folders. I knew that immediately. The paper was too bright, too new. The handwriting in the margins was Curtis's. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it slowly. It was a template, professionally formatted, with language I recognized from my years reviewing city contracts, power of attorney, limited conservatorship, a section about capacity assessment. In the margins, in Curtis's handwriting, were notes. Things like, mention the missed appointment in October, ask about the confusion with the utility bill. There was a date circled. The following month, January, he'd been inside my house without me there. He had a key because I'd given him one after Bioria died for emergencies. I sat in that room for a long time with that folder in my lap. I thought about a bridge I'd inspected early in my career, a railroad bridge outside Collierville that looked perfectly sound from the surface. You couldn't see the corrosion until you got underneath and looked at what was actually holding the weight. By the time we found it, the damage had been building for years. The bridge looked fine right up until it didn't. I put the folder back exactly where it had fallen. I took photographs of every page on my phone. I called Sergeant Whitmore that evening. He asked if I was sure I wanted to move forward. He said once the investigation became formal, it would change things with my family permanently. I said I understood that. He said, "All right, Then let's do this right. We scheduled a meeting, not at the police station. At the office of my estate attorney, the real one I'd hired the week before, a woman named Vivienne from a firm on Union Avenue. Sergeant Whitmore coordinated with her. I called Curtis and told him I'd made an appointment with the estate planner and would like him there, that I wanted family involved. He agreed immediately. That speed told me everything. The morning of the meeting, I wore the same thing I wore to my last day at the city. Gray slacks, the dark blue button-down Gloria gave me the Christmas before she got sick. I'm not superstitious, but I wanted to feel like myself walking in. Curtis and Nadine were already in the conference room when I arrived. Vivian was at the head of the table. Sergeant Whitmore was there, not in uniform, just a man in a chair with a notebook on the table in front of him, which Curtis seemed to take for a paralegal or an assistant. Vivian opened the meeting. She was direct without being theatrical. She said we were there to discuss my estate planning, and that some questions had come up that needed to be addressed before we proceeded. Curtis smiled and said he was glad Howard was finally taking this seriously. Vivian looked at him. She said, "I want to ask you directly, Curtis. Have you had access to this smart speaker in your brother's home?" The smile didn't go away right away. It took a half-second to fall. That half-second to me more than any document. Curtis said he'd set it up as a gift, that he'd help with the configuration. Vivian said, "And you maintained admin access to the account after installation?" He shifted in his seat. He said he'd just wanted to make sure it was working properly. Sergeant Whitmore placed a printed sheet on the table. Account activity log. Admin access timestamps. 37 instances of remote session activity over 8 weeks. Dates highlighted. Nadine looked at the paper and then looked at Curtis, and something moved across her face that I hadn't expected to see. It wasn't guilt, it was surprise. She hadn't known all of it. Whitmore said, "I also want to ask about this," and he slid the photographs of the conservatorship templates across the table, the ones with your handwriting in the margins. Curtis opened his mouth and then closed it. He tried the soft version first. Said he was worried about me. Said I'd been forgetful. Said the missed appointment in October, which I had not missed, I had rescheduled, which was documented, proved that I needed someone looking out for me. I waited until he was done. Then I said, "Curtis, I haven't missed an appointment in 2 years. My doctor will confirm that. My bank will confirm that the accounts are current. And the estate attorney I retained last week will confirm that I initiated this process independently, without any assistance from you." I set my own folder on the table. Medical records, bank statements, my physician's written statement, which Vivian had requested on my behalf. 11 months of evidence that I was doing exactly fine. Curtis looked at the folder and then looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him since we were kids. Like he'd been caught but hadn't figured out yet whether to be sorry or angry. He chose angry. He said I was making a fool of myself. That this was embarrassing for the whole family. That if I didn't need help, then why was I living in a house that was too big for one person? Why did I call him twice in 1 week last spring when I was worried about a leak in the roof? I said, "Because you're my brother and I trusted you." That was the only moment I felt anything close to breaking. Not anger, just grief. For the version of Curtis I'd believed in, Vivian said, quietly but clearly, that the matter was being referred for investigation by the Financial Crimes Unit, that any further contact regarding my estate, finances, health, or property would be considered interference, and that the admin account on the smart speaker was being terminated immediately with the cooperation of the device manufacturer. Sergeant Whitmore said, "Curtis, I'd like you to come with me." He left without handcuffs, just stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out without looking back at me. Nadine stayed in her seat. She pressed her hands flat on the table and stared at them. After a long moment, she said, "Howard, I didn't know how far he'd taken it." I said, "I know." I didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say that would have helped either of us. The drive home took 20 minutes. I went down Poplar to the neighborhood, past the Kroger where Gloria and I used to do the grocery shopping on Sunday mornings, past the gas station where I'd stopped 1,000 times, past all the things that make up a life without announcing themselves. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car with the engine off. I went inside and unplugged the speaker and put it in a box in the garage. Then I went and found the Christmas ornaments, which were exactly where I should have looked in the first place, in the closet in the hallway, behind the winter coats. I put up the tree. It took most of the evening. Some of the ornaments were ones Gloria had since before we were married, little glass birds she'd collected. I hung every one of them. In the weeks after, I worked through the practical things. Changed the locks, revoked Curtis's key, updated my estate documents with Vivienne, converted the CD to a properly structured trust account, which Paulette had been nudging me to do for a year and I'd kept putting off. I had a real conversation with my doctor, told him what had happened, made sure my medical records reflected my actual cognitive state clearly. My doctor said, "Howard, I've been your physician for 9 years. You are one of the sharpest patients I have. The criminal investigation is still ongoing. I won't say more than that because I don't know more than that. What I know is that Curtis has not contacted me, and I have not contacted him." Nadine called once about a month later. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't understood how serious it had gotten. I believe her partly. People can know something is wrong and still let it continue because they don't want to be the one who says stop. That's not the same as being innocent, but it's also not the same as being the one who drew the plans. Ellis asked me one Saturday, over coffee, whether I was all right. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said, "I'm getting there." He nodded. He didn't push it further. That's the thing about people who've been around long enough. They know when you're telling the truth and they know when to let it be enough. I still live in the same house. I still drink my coffee in the kitchen in the mornings, and I still watch the bird feeder out the back window. I haven't refilled it yet. I'm planning to, come spring. Gloria would have said I waited long enough. What I carry from all of this isn't fear exactly. It's more like a recalibration. 30 years of reading load-bearing structures taught me that the things most likely to fail aren't the ones you can see from the road. They're the ones that look fine from the outside, while something underneath is quietly giving way. You have to get underneath. You have to check what's actually holding the weight. The same is true for people. If you're listening to this and you have a family member who is suddenly very interested in your finances, your health, your documents, who uses words like managing things or planning for the future in a way that puts them at the center of your decisions, I'm not saying assume the worst. I'm saying pay attention. Ask questions. Talk to your doctor, your bank, a lawyer, a neighbor you trust. Check the admin settings on anything someone else set up in your home. The people who are planning to take something from you are counting on the fact that you won't check. They're counting on your gratitude and your trust, and you're not wanting to believe it. Don't make it that easy for them. And if this story sounds like something that's already happening to you or someone you love, I want you to know that it is not too late to get underneath it and see what's actually there. Your clarity is not gone just because someone has been working to convince you otherwise. Your name on your own documents still means something. Your instincts still mean something. Don't let anyone tell you differently. Thank you for listening. Share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice in this community matters. And if this reached you at the right moment, share it. Because these situations survive in silence and they fall apart in the light.